The Vanishing of the Roanoke Colony, America's oldest unsolved mystery. Introduction. The word that haunts history. On a sweltering August day in 1590, John White stood on the shore of Roanoke Island, his heart pounding as he scanned the landscape before him. 3 long years had passed since he had last seen this place. 3 years since he had reluctantly left behind his daughter, his granddaughter, and over 100 English colonists who had placed their faith in him. Now, as he made his way through the overgrown paths toward the settlement, an eerie silence greeted him. No voices called out in welcome. No children ran to meet the arriving ships. The only sound was the whisper of wind through the trees and the distant crash of waves against the outer banks. What John White discovered that day would become one of the most enduring mysteries in American history. The colonists had vanished. Every man, woman, and child had disappeared without a trace, leaving behind only their possessions, their homes, and a single cryptic word carved into a wooden post: Croatoan. This word, and the mystery it represents, has captivated historians, archaeologists, and mystery enthusiasts for more than 4 centuries. It stands as America's oldest cold case, a puzzle that spans generations and refuses to yield its secrets. The story of the lost colony of Roanoke is more than just a historical curiosity. It represents the first English attempt to establish a permanent settlement in the New World, a bold and ultimately tragic experiment that preceded the successful Jamestown colony by nearly 2 decades. The fate of these pioneers has implications that reach far beyond their individual stories. Their disappearance raises questions about early colonial life, Native American relations, survival in an unfamiliar land, and the very nature of historical truth itself. What happened to these people? Did they die, or did they survive? Were they victims of violence, or did they choose to integrate with local tribes? Did they perish from disease and starvation, or did they relocate and establish themselves elsewhere? The mystery is made all the more compelling by the human element at its heart. Among the missing were families, children, pregnant women, and elderly settlers. Virginia Dare, born just days after the colony's arrival, holds the distinction of being the first English child born in North America. She was merely 3 years old when she vanished along with everyone else. Her grandfather, John White, spent the rest of his life haunted by his failure to return in time to save them. The personal tragedy of his story adds emotional weight to the historical puzzle. Over the centuries, countless theories have been proposed to explain the colonists' fate. Some suggest they were massacred by hostile Native American tribes. Others believe they were absorbed into local indigenous populations, their descendants living on among the Lumbee people of North Carolina. Still others point to evidence of relocation, suggesting the colonists moved inland and established themselves at multiple sites before ultimately succumbing to drought, disease, or conflict. Archaeological evidence continues to emerge, each new discovery adding pieces to the puzzle while raising new questions. DNA studies have been conducted. Ancient artifacts have been unearthed. Tree ring data has revealed devastating droughts. Yet despite all our modern scientific capabilities, the complete truth remains frustratingly out of reach. The Roanoke mystery occupies a unique place in American consciousness. It represents the beginning of our national story, the first chapter in the long and complex narrative of European colonization. It reminds us that history is not always a clear record of facts and dates, but often a collection of fragments, clues, and educated guesses. The lost colony forces us to confront the limits of historical knowledge and the uncomfortable reality that some questions may never be answered, no matter how desperately we seek closure. Tonight, we embark on a journey back to the 16th century, to a small island off the coast of what is now North Carolina. We will explore the political ambitions that led to the colony's establishment, the people who risked everything to settle in an unknown land, and the circumstances that led to their mysterious disappearance. We will examine the evidence, consider the theories, and walk through the archaeological discoveries that continue to shed new light on this ancient mystery. We will meet the Native American peoples who witnessed these events, whose own perspectives and experiences are crucial to understanding what truly happened. And we will follow John White on his desperate journey back to Roanoke, sharing his horror and heartbreak as he confronted the empty silence of the abandoned colony. The story of Roanoke is a story of ambition and tragedy, of courage and loss, of mystery and perhaps, ultimately, of survival. It is a story that has been told and retold for generations, each telling adding new interpretations and insights. It is a story that begins not on Roanoke Island itself, but in the royal courts of England, where powerful men dreamed of empire and wealth beyond measure. To understand the mystery of the lost colony, we must first understand why these people came to this dangerous shore in the first place, and what forces conspired to leave them stranded and forgotten on the edge of an untamed continent. So, settle in as we unravel one of history's greatest mysteries. Let the sounds of 16th century England wash over you. Imagine the creaking of wooden ships, the rustle of maps being unfurled, the heated debates in royal chambers about the future of the new world. Picture the faces of those brave or desperate enough to leave everything they knew for an uncertain future in a land they could barely imagine. And prepare yourself for a story that has no easy answers, no simple resolution, but instead offers us something perhaps more valuable: a window into the courage, folly, and enduring mystery of the human experience. This is the story of the vanishing of the Roanoke colony, the age of exploration and English ambitions. To understand the Roanoke colony, we must first understand the world that created it. The late 16th century was an age of extraordinary transformation in Europe. New technologies in navigation and shipbuilding had opened up the world's oceans to exploration and exploitation. The compass, the astrolabe, and improved cartography meant that ships could venture far from familiar shores and actually find their way back again. The development of sturdy, ocean-going vessels capable of carrying large crews and substantial cargo made long voyages practical for the first time in human history. The world was suddenly smaller, and to the European powers of the age, it represented an unprecedented opportunity for wealth and expansion. Spain had taken the early lead in this new age of exploration. Christopher Columbus's voyage in 1492 had opened the Americas to European awareness, and Spanish conquistadors had wasted no time in claiming vast territories for the Spanish crown. By the 1580s, Spain controlled enormous portions of Central and South America, extracting incredible wealth in the form of gold, silver, and other resources. Spanish treasure fleets regularly crossed the Atlantic, carrying fortunes back to Europe. The Spanish Empire was the superpower of its age, wealthy, powerful, and seemingly unstoppable. Other European nations watched with a mixture of envy and alarm as Spain's influence and riches grew. England, under Queen Elizabeth I, found itself in an awkward position. The nation was relatively small, still recovering from religious upheavals and internal conflicts, and definitely not in Spain's league when it came to military might or colonial holdings. Elizabeth's father, Henry VIII, had broken with the Catholic Church, establishing the Church of England and setting in motion decades of religious tension, both within England and with Catholic powers like Spain. By Elizabeth's reign, England was definitively Protestant, which put it at odds with Catholic Spain and made any conflict between them take on the character of a religious war as well as a political one. Despite these challenges, Elizabeth was determined that England should have its share of the New World's riches. The question was how to achieve this. Direct military confrontation with Spain was risky and expensive. England's navy, while respectable, could not match Spain's in open warfare, but there were other strategies available. English privateers, operating with the unofficial blessing of the Crown, began attacking Spanish treasure ships and colonial outposts. These legalized pirates, among them the famous Sir Francis Drake, captured Spanish gold and disrupted Spanish trade, enriching themselves and the English treasury while weakening Spain's grip on its American empire. It was a clever strategy, providing the benefits of warfare without the costs and risks of full-scale military engagement. But privateering alone would not be enough to establish English power in the Americas. What England needed was its own foothold in the New World, its own colonies that could provide resources, serve as bases for military and commercial operations, and demonstrate to the world that England was a force to be reckoned with. The challenge was immense. Establishing a colony required enormous resources, careful planning, and colonists willing to risk everything for an uncertain future. It required finding a suitable location, transporting people and supplies across a dangerous ocean, and maintaining lines of communication and supply over thousands of miles of open water. Most daunting of all, it required surviving in a land that was already inhabited by people who might not welcome foreign settlers. Enter Sir Walter Raleigh, one of the most remarkable figures of the Elizabethan age. Raleigh was a soldier, explorer, poet, and courtier who had won Queen Elizabeth's favor through a combination of military success, intellectual brilliance, and personal charm. He was exactly the sort of ambitious, multi-talented individual that the age of exploration seemed to produce in abundance. Raleigh understood that establishing colonies in the New World could bring prestige, wealth, and strategic advantage to England. He also understood that it would require vision, determination, and substantial financial investment. In 1584, Queen Elizabeth granted Raleigh a charter to explore and colonize lands in North America. The charter was remarkably generous, giving Raleigh the rights to any lands he discovered that were not already claimed by Christian monarchs. In practical terms, this meant he could claim any territory not controlled by Spain, Portugal, or France. The charter also specified that any colonies established must follow English law and remain loyal to the English crown. Raleigh would have significant freedom to establish colonies as he saw fit, but they would remain English possessions, extensions of Elizabeth's realm into the New World. Raleigh wasted no time putting this charter to use. In 1584, he sent an exploratory expedition to scout the coast of North America and identify promising locations for settlement. The expedition, led by Philip Amadas and Arthur Barlow, explored the region around the Outer Banks of what is now North Carolina. They were impressed by what they found. The land seemed fertile and abundant. The climate was temperate. There were protected harbors where ships could safely anchor. And the Native American peoples they encountered, particularly the Croatoan and Secotan tribes, seemed friendly and willing to trade. Amadas and Barlow returned to England with glowing reports of the region, which they named Virginia in honor of Elizabeth, the Virgin Queen. The Virgin. They brought with them 2 Native Americans, Manteo and Wanchese, who would play crucial roles in the colonization attempts to come. Manteo, a member of the Croatoan tribe, proved to be a valuable ally and intermediary. Wanchese, from the Secotan people, was more skeptical of English intentions and would eventually turn against the colonists. The presence of these 2 men in England caused a sensation. They were living proof of the New World and its inhabitants, and their testimony about the region's resources and potential helped Raleigh secure support for his colonial venture. The strategic location of the area could hardly be overstated. The Outer Banks and the sounds behind them provided excellent harbors and defensive positions. A colony established there could serve as a base for English ships, including privateers preying on Spanish vessels traveling through the Caribbean and along the North American coast. It could also serve as a staging ground for further exploration and colonization of the continent's interior. The land itself seemed capable of producing crops, timber, and other valuable resources. In short, it seemed like the perfect location for England's first permanent colony in North America. But there were challenges that the initial expedition either failed to recognize or chose to downplay. The region's Native American population was substantial and organized into complex political alliances. While some tribes might welcome English trade and friendship, others would inevitably view the colonists as threats or competitors. The Spanish, who claimed much of the southeastern coast of North America, would not look kindly on English encroachment into what they considered their territory. The Atlantic crossing was dangerous, and maintaining regular contact and supply lines between England and a distant colony would be difficult and expensive. And the colonists themselves would face enormous challenges adapting to an unfamiliar environment, dealing with diseases, finding food, and establishing functional communities in the wilderness. Raleigh, however, was optimistic. He had royal backing, financial resources, and a clear vision of what he wanted to achieve. In 1585, he was ready to send his first group of colonists to establish a permanent English presence in the New World. This first attempt would be a military colony, led by Ralph Lane, and designed primarily as a base of operations rather than a true settlement. It would be a test, a learning experience that would inform future, larger colonization efforts. What Raleigh could not know was that this first colony would fail, setting the stage for an even more ambitious second attempt, one that would end in mystery and tragedy that would echo through the centuries. The stage was set. England's ambitions, the strategic importance of the North American coast, the appeal of the Virginia territory, and Raleigh's determination to succeed all converged on a small island off the coast of Suez, what would become North Carolina. Roanoke Island would become the site of England's first serious attempt to establish a lasting presence in the New World. The men and women who would eventually settle there could not have imagined the mystery their disappearance would create. They were simply people trying to build new lives in a new land, caught up in forces far larger than themselves. The clash of empires, the meeting of vastly different cultures, and the unforgiving challenges of survival on the edge of the known world. The first Roanoke expedition, lessons in failure. The first English colony at Roanoke Island was never meant to be permanent. Established in 1585 under the leadership of Ralph Lane, it was essentially a military outpost, a forward base for English operations in the New World, rather than a true settlement of families and farmers. Lane, a career soldier and experienced military commander, arrived with approximately 100 men. Notably absent were women and children. This was to be a garrison, not a community, and its primary purposes were to explore the region, establish English claims to the territory, search for valuable resources, and serve as a base for privateers harassing Spanish shipping. From the beginning, the expedition faced challenges that would foreshadow the difficulties of the later lost colony. The colonists arrived too late in the season to plant crops, meaning they would be dependent on supplies from England and on trade with local Native American tribes. Their military mindset and approach to dealing with the indigenous peoples would create tensions that would have lasting consequences. And their focus on finding gold and other quick sources of wealth, rather than on establishing sustainable agricultural practices, would leave them vulnerable when supply lines failed. Ralph Lane was by all accounts a capable military leader, but perhaps not the ideal person to establish friendly relations with the native peoples. He approached the situation as he would a military campaign, viewing the indigenous population through a lens of potential threat and alliance, rather than as partners in a shared enterprise. Initially, relations with the Croatoan and Socotan peoples were cordial. The Native Americans were curious about the English, interested in trade, and apparently willing to coexist with this strange new presence on their shores. Manteo, the Croatoan man who had traveled to England with the earlier expedition, served as an interpreter and intermediary, helping to facilitate communication and trade. But Lane's colony quickly became demanding. The English needed food, and they expected the Native Americans to provide it. This was not an unreasonable expectation in the context of trade relationships, but Lane's approach was often heavy-handed. When he felt the native peoples were not providing enough food, he resorted to threats and shows of force. This created resentment and fear among the indigenous population. They were being asked to support over 100 additional mouths during times when their own food supplies were carefully managed and stored for the winter months. The English did not seem to understand or respect the delicate balance of subsistence living in the region. The situation deteriorated when Lane became convinced that Chief Wingina of the Socotan people was plotting against the English. Whether this suspicion was justified remains a matter of historical debate. Wingina had initially been friendly to the colonists, even taking the baptismal name Pemisipan to demonstrate his connection to them. But as tensions grew and English demands became more burdensome, his attitude changed. Lane interpreted this change as evidence of hostile intent. In June of 1586, Lane led a preemptive strike against Wingina's village, killing the chief and several of his warriors. This action destroyed any remaining goodwill between the English and many of the Socotan peoples. The colony's situation continued to worsen. Supplies from England were delayed. The colonists had not successfully established their own food production. Relations with most Native American groups were strained or openly hostile. The men were becoming demoralized and desperate. It seemed that the first English colony in the New World was on the verge of collapse. Then, in June of 1586, salvation appeared in an unexpected form. Sir Francis Drake and his fleet arrived at Roanoke after a successful privateering campaign in the Caribbean. Drake offered to take the colonists back to England, and Lane accepted. The entire colony abandoned Roanoke Island and returned home with Drake. Interestingly, just weeks after they left, a supply ship arrived from England, finding the settlement deserted. Shortly after that, another ship arrived, this one sent by Raleigh, specifically to check on the colony's progress. It too found only empty buildings and departed. The timing was remarkably unlucky. If the supply ships had arrived just a few weeks earlier, the colony might have survived, and the history of English colonization might have unfolded very differently. Despite its failure, the Lane colony provided valuable lessons, though it is unclear how well those lessons were learned. The colonists had confirmed that the region could be reached and that Europeans could survive there, at least for a period of months. They had mapped the area and identified various resources. They had established that it was possible to grow European crops in the Virginia soil, though Lane's men had not done so successfully. They had also learned, or should have learned, that maintaining good relations with the indigenous population was absolutely crucial to survival. Food could not be taken by force indefinitely. The native peoples were numerous, organized, and perfectly capable of defending themselves when threatened. Any future colony would need to approach relations with the indigenous population with more wisdom and restraint than Lane had shown. Another lesson, though a subtle one, involved the location of Roanoke Island itself. While it provided some defensive advantages, it was not ideal for a self-sustaining agricultural colony. The island had limited space for farming. It was separated from the mainland, making trade and communication with native peoples more difficult, and it was vulnerable to storms and flooding from the Atlantic. A better location might have been inland along one of the major rivers, where there would be more land for farming, easier access to Native American trading partners, and better protection from coastal storms. Whether this lesson was truly understood or simply ignored in later planning remains debatable. The first Roanoke colony also revealed the immense logistical challenges of maintaining a settlement so far from England. The Atlantic crossing took weeks even under favorable conditions. Ships could be delayed by weather, damaged by storms, or lost entirely. Sending supplies across thousands of miles of ocean was expensive and unreliable. Communication was slow to the point of being almost useless for making timely decisions. If a colony needed help, it might be months before that need could be communicated to England, and months more before assistance could arrive. This meant that any successful colony would need to be as self-sufficient as possible, able to survive for extended periods without support from home. Perhaps most importantly, the Lane expedition demonstrated that a military garrison was not the right model for colonization. Soldiers made poor farmers and worse diplomats. They were trained to take orders, fight enemies, and accomplish specific military objectives. They were not equipped, either by training or temperament, to build communities, establish trade relationships, learn new agricultural techniques, or adapt to life in an unfamiliar culture. What was needed for successful colonization was not a garrison, but a genuine settlement. Families with ties to each other and reasons to stay. People with farming skills. Craftsmen who could build and maintain the infrastructure of a functioning community. And leaders who understood that their success depended on cooperation and adaptation rather than domination. All of these lessons were available to be learned from the Lane expedition. Whether they would be applied to the next attempt remained to be seen. What is clear is that Sir Walter Raleigh remained committed to his vision of an English colony in Virginia. The failure of the Lane expedition did not discourage him. If anything, it made him more determined to succeed. He began planning a second, more ambitious colonization effort. This time, there would be families, women, and children. This time, the goal would be a true settlement, not a military outpost. This time, the colony would be led by John White, an artist and gentleman who had been part of the Lane expedition and who had established friendly relations with Manteo and other Native Americans. This time, surely, things would be different. But as we now know, this second attempt would not end in simple failure. It would end in mystery, in a disappearance so complete and baffling that it would haunt American history for centuries to come. The stage was set for the lost colony of Roanoke, John White and the colony of 1587. John White was a very different kind of leader from Ralph Lane. Where Lane was a soldier, White was an artist and mapmaker. He had accompanied the 1585 expedition not as a military commander, but as a documenter, creating detailed drawings and watercolors of the native peoples, their villages, the local flora and fauna, and the landscape itself. His artwork provides us with some of the most valuable visual records of 16th century Native American life and the early colonial period. White's artistic eye gave him a different perspective on the New World. He saw it not just as a strategic asset or a source of wealth, but as a fascinating new world worthy of careful observation and appreciation. When Sir Walter Raleigh began planning a second colonization attempt, he turned to John White to lead it. White had experience with the region, had established friendly relationships with some Native Americans, particularly Manteo, and seemed to have a more diplomatic and less confrontational approach than Lane. Perhaps most importantly, White was willing to take on the enormous responsibility of leading not a military garrison, but a true settlement colony, one that would include families, women, and children. White's own family would be part of this venture. His pregnant daughter, Eleanor Dare, and her husband, Ananias Dare, were among the colonists. This personal stake in the colony's success gave White additional motivation to make the venture work. The colonists who assembled for this second expedition were a diverse group. Historical records indicate there were approximately 117 colonists in total, including women and children. These were not soldiers, but civilians looking for new opportunities in the New World. Some were craftsmen, carpenters, blacksmiths, and other skilled workers necessary for building and maintaining a settlement. Some were farmers who hoped to establish successful agricultural operations. There were also several gentlemen investors who had purchased shares in the colonization venture and hoped to profit from it. Each colonist had their own reasons for making the journey. Some sought economic opportunity. Others may have been fleeing debt or legal troubles in England. Some were probably motivated by a sense of adventure or religious calling. All of them were taking an enormous risk. The plan for this colony differed from the Lane expedition in several crucial ways. First, as mentioned, it was to be a true civilian settlement rather than a military outpost. Second, the original plan called for the colony to be established not at Roanoke Island, but further north in the Chesapeake Bay area. This location was thought to offer better farming land, a more defensible position, and potentially friendlier Native American neighbors. The colonists carried with them seeds for European crops, tools for farming and construction, and supplies meant to sustain them until they could become self-sufficient. White had been appointed governor of the colony, a position that came with significant authority and responsibility. The expedition departed England in May of 1587 aboard 3 ships commanded by Simon Fernandez, a Portuguese navigator in English service. From the beginning, there were tensions between White and Fernandez. Fernandez was primarily interested in privateering and seemed to view the colonization mission as secondary to opportunities for capturing Spanish ships and cargo. This fundamental disagreement about priorities would have serious consequences for the colony. The voyage across the Atlantic took approximately 2 months, a time fraught with danger from storms, disease, and the constant threat of encountering Spanish warships. The colonists finally sighted land in early July, making landfall near the outer banks of present-day North Carolina. According to the original plan, they were to stop at Roanoke Island only briefly to pick up a small garrison that had been left there, then proceed north to the Chesapeake Bay to establish the actual colony. But Simon Fernandez had other ideas. When the colonists landed at Roanoke Island on July 20, 1587, Fernandez announced that he was going no further. He claimed it was too late in the season to safely navigate to the Chesapeake Bay and still return to England before winter made Atlantic crossings too dangerous. He told White and the colonists that they would have to stay at Roanoke Island. This was a devastating blow to the colony's plans. Roanoke Island was not where they wanted to be. The Lane expedition had left bad feelings with many local Native American groups. The island itself was less than ideal for farming. But the colonists had no choice. Fernandez controlled the ships, and without his cooperation, they could not reach the Chesapeake Bay. They would have to make Roanoke Island work. The colonists set about repairing and rebuilding the structures left behind by the Lane expedition. They began clearing land for farming and planting crops, though it was late in the growing season. They attempted to establish peaceful relations with the Croatoan people, who remembered Manteo favorably. Manteo himself played a crucial role in these efforts, acting as interpreter and advocate for the English. In recognition of his assistance and loyalty, he was later christened as a member of the Church of England and given the title Lord of Roanoke, a symbolic gesture meant to demonstrate the partnership between the English and at least some Native American groups. But relations with other Native American groups remained tense or hostile. The Secotan people, in particular, had not forgotten Ralph Lane's violence against them. Just a few days after the colonists' arrival, one of their members, George Howe, was killed by Native Americans while crabbing alone. This murder demonstrated that the colonists were not safe and that the hostilities of the previous expedition had not been forgotten or forgiven. It also highlighted the vulnerability of the settlement. The colonists were outnumbered by the indigenous population and dependent on Native American goodwill for trade and peaceful coexistence. Despite these challenges, there were also moments of hope and promise. On August 18, 1587, Eleanor Dare gave birth to a daughter, Virginia Dare. She was the first English child born in North America, a symbolic milestone in the colonization effort. The birth must have been a moment of celebration for the colony, a sign that they were not just visitors or temporary residents, but people putting down roots in this new land. Other colonists were also building families and making plans for the future. For a brief moment, it might have seemed that the colony could succeed, but the reality of their situation was precarious. They had arrived too late to plant adequate crops for the winter. Their supplies from England would not last indefinitely. They needed more tools, more food, and more colonists to make the settlement truly viable. It became clear that someone would need to return to England to organize a supply mission and recruit additional colonists. The question was, who should go? As governor, John White was the logical choice. He had the authority to speak for the colony, the connections in England to secure support, and the credibility to convince potential investors and colonists to join the venture. But White was also Eleanor's father and Virginia's grandfather. Leaving them behind must have been agonizing. The colonists apparently pressured White to make the journey, arguing that he was the person best positioned to ensure the colony's survival. After much debate and soul-searching, White agreed to return to England. He would organize a supply mission and return as quickly as possible. Before he left, the colonists agreed on a plan for communication. If they had to leave Roanoke Island for any reason, they would carve their destination into a prominent tree or post. If they were leaving under duress or in danger, they would also carve a Maltese cross above the message. This simple plan would later become the source of one of history's greatest mysteries. White departed Roanoke Island in late August 1580, just 9 days after Virginia's birth. As his ship sailed away from the Outer Banks, he looked back at the settlement, at the smoke rising from the colonists' fires, at the place where his daughter and granddaughter remained. He could not have known that he would never see them again. He could not have known that the 3 months he expected to be away would stretch into 3 years. He could not have imagined the nightmare that was about to unfold, a nightmare that would haunt him for the rest of his life and create a mystery that would endure for centuries. The colonists watched White's ship disappear over the horizon. They were alone now on their island, isolated from England by thousands of miles of ocean, surrounded by a land they barely understood, and peoples whose languages and customs remained largely foreign to them. They faced a winter with uncertain food supplies, potential hostile neighbors, and no guarantee that help would arrive. Yet, they must have had hope. They were English subjects, representing the Queen and the Crown. Surely they would not be abandoned. Surely John White would return with supplies and reinforcements. Surely they could survive until then. All they had to do was endure, adapt, and maintain their fragile foothold on the edge of the new world. What they did not know, what they could not know, was that forces far beyond their control were about to make John White's return impossible, leaving them to face their fate alone. White's departure and the long absence. John White arrived back in England in November of 1587, his mind filled with plans for quickly organizing a supply mission and returning to Roanoke. He understood the urgency of the situation. The colonists had limited supplies. They needed tools, food, and additional people to make the settlement viable. Every week of delay increased the risks to his daughter, his infant granddaughter, and all the colonists who had placed their faith in him. But White was about to discover that the best-laid plans often collapse in the face of larger political and military events. England in late 1587 and throughout 1588 was a nation preparing for war. Tensions with Spain had reached a breaking point. King Philip II of Spain, angered by English support for Dutch rebels, English privateering against Spanish ships, and England's Protestant faith, was assembling a massive invasion force. The Spanish Armada, a fleet of over 130 warships carrying thousands of soldiers, was being prepared to invade England, overthrow Queen Elizabeth, and place a Catholic monarch on the English throne. This was an existential threat to England. If the Armada succeeded, everything would change. Religion, government, England's place in the world, everything. Faced with this threat, Queen Elizabeth's government mobilized every available resource for defense. Ships were commandeered for military service. Experienced sailors were pressed into the Royal Navy. Resources were diverted to coastal defenses and military preparations. Private ventures, including colonization efforts, were placed on hold. The very survival of England was at stake. Under these circumstances, John White's urgent need to resupply a distant colony seemed less important than the immediate need to defend the homeland. White found himself caught in a web of bureaucracy, military, priorities, and simple bad luck. White did manage to secure 2 small ships for a relief voyage in the spring of 1588, but the situation quickly went wrong. The captains of these vessels were more interested in privateering than in delivering supplies to Roanoke. Rather than sailing directly to North America, they sought out Spanish and French ships to attack. In one of these encounters, White's ship was badly damaged in a fight with a French vessel, and White himself was injured. The expedition was forced to return to England without ever reaching Roanoke. The colonists would have to survive another year without help. Meanwhile, the Spanish Armada sailed toward England in July of 1588. What followed was one of the most famous naval engagements in history. English ships, aided by bad weather and superior tactics, defeated the Armada, scattering the Spanish fleet and killing thousands of Spanish sailors and soldiers. It was a tremendous victory for England and Queen Elizabeth, cementing England's position as a rising naval power and effectively ending the Spanish threat to invade. But this victory came at a cost. The naval campaign had exhausted England's resources. The country needed time to recover financially and militarily. Private ventures like colonial expeditions would have to wait. For John White, the defeat of the Armada should have meant that he could finally return to Roanoke. But the bureaucratic obstacles continued. Ships remained under government control. Investment in colonial ventures was difficult to secure when the nation's finances were depleted. Sir Walter Raleigh, the expedition's sponsor, was busy with other matters, including falling in and out of favor with Queen Elizabeth due to his secret marriage to one of her ladies-in-waiting. Months turned into a year, and then into 2 years. White wrote desperate letters, begged for assistance, and sought any possible way to return to his family, but every avenue seemed blocked. During this long and agonizing wait, White must have been tormented by questions and fears. Were the colonists still alive? Had they managed to survive the winters? Had they been attacked? Had they starved? Were his daughter and granddaughter among the living or the dead? He had no way of knowing. Communication across the Atlantic was dependent on ships making the dangerous crossing, and no ships had visited Roanoke since he had left. The colony existed in a state of complete isolation, unknown and unreachable, while White could only imagine their fate. Finally, in 1590, 3 years after his departure, White managed to secure passage on a privateering expedition led by John Watts. This was not an official relief mission. The ships were primarily engaged in privateering, seeking to capture Spanish vessels and cargo. But they agreed to stop at Roanoke Island long enough for White to check on the colony. It was not the relief mission White had hoped to lead, with supplies and reinforcements, but at least it would allow him to see what had happened to the colonists and hopefully bring them desperately needed supplies. The voyage was long and dangerous. The ships engaged Spanish vessels in the Caribbean, taking prizes and fighting battles. White had to endure watching these military and commercial operations take priority, while his need to reach Roanoke burned inside him. Finally, in August of 1590, 3 years to the month after he had left, the ships approached the Outer Banks. White saw the familiar coastline, the same beaches and forests he had left behind. As they drew closer, he strained his eyes looking for signs of the colony: smoke from fires, figures on the beach, boats in the water, any indication that the settlement still existed and that the colonists had survived. What he saw instead was silence and emptiness. No smoke rose above Roanoke Island. No boats came out to greet the arriving ships. The beach was deserted. An ominous quiet hung over everything. The crew anchored offshore and prepared to land. White must have felt his heart sinking, dread replacing hope as the silence persisted. Something was wrong. Even if the colonists had moved to a different location on the island, surely someone would have seen the ships and come to investigate. The complete absence of any human presence was deeply unsettling. Before landing, the crew tried signaling the colonists. They played English tunes on trumpets. They called out greetings. They created smoke signals. There was no response. As night fell, they saw a fire glowing in the woods on the island. Could this be the colonists? White and several crew members spent an anxious night aboard the ships, planning to investigate the fire in the morning. That night must have been one of the longest of White's life, suspended between hope and fear, imagining what they might find in the morning. The next day, August 18, 1590, exactly 3 years after Virginia Dare's birth, John White finally set foot on Roanoke Island again. The date itself must have added to his emotional turmoil. His granddaughter would be 3 years old now, if she had survived. His daughter would have 3 years of experiences he had missed. As he made his way through the overgrown paths toward where the settlement had stood, every step took him closer to the truth he both desperately wanted and desperately feared to discover. What he found would create one of history's most enduring mysteries. The Return and Discovery, August 1590. The morning of August 18, 1590, dawned with a mixture of hope and dread for John White. After a sleepless night aboard the ship, watching the mysterious fire glowing on Roanoke Island, he and his companions prepared to land. The fire they had seen turned out to be nothing more than a grass fire, probably caused by lightning rather than human activity. Still, they pressed forward toward the location of the settlement. The path that had once been clear and well-traveled was now overgrown. Nature had begun, reclaiming the land in the 3 years since White's departure. Vines crept over structures. Grass grew tall where it had once been trampled by daily traffic. The very landscape spoke of abandonment. As they approached the settlement site, White began to see evidence of the colony. Palisade walls still stood, though weathered by 3 years of exposure to the elements. The fortifications actually seemed to have been strengthened since White had left, with new earthwork defenses visible. This suggested that the colonists had remained long enough to improve their defenses, which might indicate they had felt threatened, but also that they had been planning to stay. Inside the defensive perimeter, White found the buildings largely intact. The structures were still standing, their walls and roofs weathered but not collapsed. There had been no catastrophic destruction, no signs of battle or burning that might indicate a violent attack, but there were also no people. Not a single colonist remained. No bodies lay in the street or inside the buildings. No one came running to greet White and his companions. The settlement was completely, utterly empty. White walked through the silent streets of the colony he had helped establish, seeing the houses where families had lived, the workshop areas where craftsmen had labored, the common spaces where the community had gathered. Now there was only silence and absence. Personal belongings were scattered about. Iron tools and weapons lay discarded, many rusted and damaged by exposure to the weather. Books and papers had been left behind, ruined by rain and rot. Armor pieces were scattered around the fort. It appeared that items too heavy to easily transport had been left behind, but anything portable and valuable was gone. White made his way to the tree line where the colonists had agreed to carve a message if they needed to leave. There, carved into a post of the palisade in clear capital letters, was a single word: Croatoan. The letters were cleanly carved, deliberate and clear. There was no Maltese cross above or beside the word, the signal that would have indicated the colonists left under duress or in danger. According to the plan White and the colonists had agreed upon, this message meant they had relocated to Croatoan Island, the home of Manteo's people, and that they had left voluntarily rather than fleeing from immediate danger. It was a clue, a message across the years from the missing colonists to the man who had promised to return to them. White also found the letters CRO carved into a nearby tree, perhaps the beginning of another attempt to write Croatoan or possibly a separate marker. The significance of these carvings cannot be overstated. They represented the only direct communication from the lost colonists about their fate. These carved letters are the thread that connects us to them across more than 4 centuries. They tell us that at least at the time of their departure from Roanoke Island, the colonists were organized enough to leave a message, followed the agreed-upon protocol, and apparently intended to relocate to Croatoan Island, where they had allies among Manteo's people. White desperately wanted to sail immediately to Croatoan Island to find the colonists. Croatoan, also known as Hatteras Island, lay about 50 miles south of Roanoke Island. It was the homeland of the Croatoan people, who had been friendly to the English and had counted Manteo among their number. If the colonists had indeed gone there, White might find them alive and well, integrated perhaps with the Croatoan community, but surviving. It seemed like the mystery might be solved, that this 3-year nightmare might have a happy ending after all. But fate had one more cruel trick to play on John White. A storm was brewing. The ship's captains, already nervous about being near the dangerous Outer Banks in late summer hurricane season, wanted to leave as soon as possible. They agreed to try to reach Croatoan Island, but the weather was worsening. When they attempted to navigate south, they encountered dangerous seas and shoals. One ship lost 2 anchors trying to stay in position. With limited anchors remaining and the weather continuing to deteriorate, the captains made the decision to abandon the search. They would sail to the Caribbean to resupply and repair, then return to search for the colonists. White had no choice but to agree. He could not force the ships to risk destruction in the storm. Once again, he found himself sailing away from Roanoke, this time without even achieving his goal of finding the colonists. But the promised return to search Croatoan Island never happened. The ships made it to the Caribbean, but then decided to return directly to England rather than attempting another dangerous approach to the Outer Banks in late fall. White found himself back in England, having seen the empty colony, but unable to complete the search for the missing colonists. He had been so close to possibly finding them, close enough to read their message, but prevented from following that last crucial lead by weather and the decisions of ship captains more concerned with their vessels than with his desperate need for answers. John White never returned to North America. He spent his remaining years writing accounts of the colony and his searches, trying to convince others to mount expeditions to find the colonists. He corresponded with supporters and officials, always holding out hope that his daughter, granddaughter, and the other colonists might still be alive somewhere. His writings convey a deep sense of guilt and failure. He had promised to return quickly with supplies. He had been gone for 3 years. Whether the colonists had survived that wait or perished during it, he bore the weight of that absence. He had been unable to fulfill his promise, unable to save them, unable even to discover their ultimate fate. In one of his last written accounts, White expressed his anguish. "I would to God my wealth were answerable to my will." He wanted nothing more than to return, to search every island and village along the coast until he found his family, but he lacked the resources to mount such an expedition. He had to content himself with the hope that they had indeed survived, that they had found safety and perhaps a new life among the Croatoan people. He clung to the evidence of the carved letters and the absence of distress signals. Perhaps they were alive. Perhaps they had adapted and thrived. Perhaps someday he would hear news of them. But that news never came. White's last written words about the colony are dated 1593, 3 years after his final visit to Roanoke. He recorded his belief that the colonists had relocated to Croatoan Island and appealed to others to search for them there. He commended them to God's care and expressed his hope for their deliverance. After this, White disappears from the historical record. We do not know exactly when or where he died. Like the colonists he had governed, he too vanished into the silence of history, leaving behind only his writings, his artwork, and the haunting mystery of what happened to the lost colony. The Croatoan carving would become one of the most famous clues in American history. For more than 4 centuries, historians, archaeologists, and mystery enthusiasts have debated its meaning. Does it tell us where the colonists went, or only where they intended to go? Did they make it to Croatoan Island, or did something happen to them during the journey? If they reached Croatoan, what happened to them there? Why did no one ever see or hear from them again? The carved word is both an answer and a question, a message that seems clear, but leads to even deeper mysteries. In many ways, it is the perfect symbol for the lost colony itself, evidence that tantalizes us with the possibility of truth while keeping its secrets hidden. The Native American context, allies and adversaries. To understand the fate of the lost colony, we must understand the Native American peoples who inhabited the region and witnessed the arrival of the English colonists. The Outer Banks and the coastal areas of what is now North Carolina were home to multiple Algonquian-speaking tribes, each with their own territories, leaders, and political allegiances. These were not primitive peoples living in isolation, but sophisticated societies with complex social structures, extensive trade networks, and intricate political relationships. The arrival of the English colonists did not occur in a vacuum, but rather disrupted an existing world with its own dynamics, conflicts, and alliances. The Croatoan people, whose name would become forever associated with the lost colony mystery, inhabited the island now known as Hatteras Island, located about 50 miles south of Roanoke Island. They were an Algonquian-speaking people who lived primarily through a combination of farming, fishing, and hunting. Like other coastal tribes, they grew crops including corn, beans, and squash, supplemented their diet with abundant seafood from the sounds and ocean, and hunted deer and other game in the forests. Their villages consisted of longhouses made from wooden frames covered with woven mats or bark, structures that could be taken down and moved when necessary. The Croatoan had established themselves as allies of the English from the earliest contacts. Manteo, the Croatoan man who had traveled to England with the first exploratory expedition, and who had returned to serve as interpreter and intermediary for both colonial attempts, played a crucial role in establishing this alliance. Through Manteo, the Croatoan learned about English customs, technology, and intentions, while the English learned about Croatoan culture, language, and the political landscape of the region. This relationship was beneficial for both sides. The Croatoan gained a powerful potential ally and access to English trade goods, including metal tools, cloth, and other manufactured items that were valuable in the Native American economy. The English gained guides, translators, local knowledge, and at least one group of Native Americans who did not view them as threats or enemies. But the Croatoan were just one of many tribes in the region, and their alliance with the English complicated their relationships with neighboring peoples. The Secotan people, who lived along the mainland coast and rivers, had experienced much more negative interactions with the English. As we discussed earlier, Ralph Lane's military colony had created conflict with the Secotan, culminating in Lane's attack on Chief Wingina and the killing of the chief and several warriors. This violence had created lasting enmity between the Secotan and the English. When the 1587 colonists arrived, they inherited this hostility. The murder of George Howe, killed while crabbing just days after the colonists arrived, was almost certainly retaliation for the violence of the Lane expedition. The political situation was further complicated by the presence of the Powhatan Confederacy to the north. This powerful alliance of tribes, led by the paramount chief Wahunsinakah, known to the English as Chief Powhatan, controlled much of the coastal and Piedmont region of what is now Virginia. The Powhatan Confederacy was a sophisticated political entity, with Wahunsinakah exercising authority over multiple tribes through a combination of hereditary rights, military power, and political marriages. The Confederacy was expansionist, regularly incorporating or subjugating neighboring tribes. The tribes of the Outer Banks region existed in the shadow of this powerful neighbor, aware that the Powhatan Confederacy represented both a potential threat and a potential ally depending on circumstances. The arrival of the English colonists introduced a new element into this already complex political landscape. From the Native American perspective, English represented both opportunities and threats. On one hand, they brought valuable trade goods and technology. Metal tools were far superior to stone implements for many tasks. English cloth had qualities that Native American textiles could not match. English weapons, particularly firearms, represented a significant military advantage. Alliance with the English might provide protection against hostile neighbors or help shift the regional balance of power. These were not trivial considerations in a world where intertribal conflicts, territorial disputes, and power struggles were constant features of life. On the other hand, the English also represented serious threats. They claimed ownership of land and seemed to expect the native peoples to accept English authority. They demanded food and resources, sometimes taking by force what they could not obtain through trade. They did not always respect Native American customs, territories, or leadership. Their diseases, though the colonists did not understand disease transmission any better than the native peoples did, seemed to spread sickness and death among indigenous populations. Their presence disrupted existing trade networks and political relationships. And perhaps most concerning, it was unclear what their ultimate intentions were. Did they plan to remain small communities that could coexist with native peoples? Or were they the vanguard of a much larger invasion that would eventually overwhelm and displace the indigenous population? Different Native American leaders and tribes answered these questions in different ways, leading to different strategies for dealing with the English. Manteo and the Croatoan chose alliance, betting that cooperation with the English would bring more benefits than costs. Some Secotan leaders chose hostility, viewing the English as invaders who had already proven their willingness to use violence. Other tribes took a wait-and-see approach, neither fully embracing nor fully rejecting the English presence. Still others may have seen the English as potential allies against traditional enemies. a way to gain advantage in existing conflicts. This diversity of responses meant that the lost colonists found themselves in a highly unstable political environment. They could not assume that friendly relations with one tribe meant safety from all Native Americans. They could not assume that an attack by one group meant all Native peoples were hostile. They had to navigate complex political relationships that they barely understood, using interpreters like Manteo to communicate, but often missing the subtle nuances of Native American political discourse. Every interaction with Native peoples carried risks and required careful diplomacy. The Native American perspective on the lost colony's disappearance is crucial to understanding what might have happened. If the colonists were killed, Native Americans would have known about it. If they relocated and integrated with indigenous communities, Native Americans would have been witnesses and participants. If they died from disease or starvation, Native Americans living nearby would have known. Any complete explanation of the lost colony's fate must account for what the indigenous peoples of the region knew, saw, and did. Unfortunately, we have very little direct testimony from Native American sources about what happened to the colonists. The indigenous peoples of the Outer Banks did not have written languages in the 16th century, so they left no written records. By the time English colonists returned to the region in large numbers in the 17th century, decades had passed, and whatever oral traditions might have preserved the story had either been lost or were not shared with the English. We do have some tantalizing clues from later English sources. When the Jamestown colonists arrived in 1607, 20 years after the lost colony, they heard reports from Native Americans about English people living among tribes to the south. Some reports suggested that members of the lost colony had survived and integrated with Native communities. Other reports were more ominous, suggesting that some colonists had been killed by Chief Powhatan's forces. William Strachey, who served as secretary of the Jamestown colony, recorded Native American accounts claiming that Powhatan had ordered the massacre of colonists who had settled near Chesapeake Bay. Whether these reports referred to the lost colonists or to other unknown groups of English settlers is unclear. What is clear is that the fate of the lost colony cannot be understood without understanding the Native American world into which they ventured. The colonists were not alone in a wilderness, but rather guests or invaders, depending on perspective, in a land that was already inhabited, organized, and claimed. Their survival depended not just on their own efforts, but on their relationships with the indigenous peoples who held the knowledge, resources, and power in this unfamiliar territory. Whether they found acceptance, hostility, or some complex mixture of both would determine whether they lived or died, whether they maintained their English identity or adopted native ways, whether they remained a distinct community or disappeared entirely into the indigenous population. The Croatoan carving suggests they chose, or were forced, to seek shelter with Manteo's people. Whether this decision saved them or merely delayed their ultimate fate is one of the central questions of the mystery. Major theories: integration and survival. The Croatoan carving left by the colonists has naturally led many researchers to believe that at least some of the lost colonists survived by integrating with Native American tribes, particularly the Croatoan people. This theory, which we might call the integration or survival theory, suggests that the colonists recognized their situation was untenable on Roanoke Island and made the decision to relocate to Kiitaos, Croatoan Island, where Manteo's people could provide food, shelter, and protection. Once there, according to this theory, they gradually integrated into Croatoan society, intermarrying with the native population and eventually losing their distinct English identity while contributing European genetic lineage and possibly some cultural elements to the indigenous community. This theory has several compelling pieces of evidence supporting it. First and foremost is the Croatoan carving itself, which clearly indicates the colonists' intention to relocate to Croatoan Island. The absence of a distress signal suggests this relocation was planned and voluntary, rather than a desperate flight from immediate danger. The fact that the colonists took the time to carve this message demonstrates they were still organized and thinking about John White's eventual return. They wanted him to know where they had gone, and they followed the agreed-upon protocol for doing so. Second, we have historical reports from the early 17th century about Native Americans with European features living in the coastal regions of North Carolina. When English colonists returned to the region decades after the lost colony, they heard accounts of indigenous people with light-colored eyes, lighter skin, and in some cases, European facial features. Some of these reports came from the Jamestown colonists, who heard stories about white people living among native tribes to the south. Later explorers and settlers in North Carolina reported similar observations. While these reports could be exaggerated or misinterpreted, they are consistent with the idea that some lost colonists or their descendants had intermarried with Native Americans. Third, there is the modern connection to the Lumbee people of North Carolina. The Lumbee, who primarily live in Robeson County in the southeastern part of the state, have long maintained oral traditions claiming descent from the lost colonists. These traditions suggest that the colonists moved from Croatoan Island inland along rivers, eventually settling among the ancestors of the Lumbee people. The Lumbee have historically had unusual characteristics compared to other Native American tribes in the region. They speak English as their primary language and have done so since before contact with later European settlers. They have English surnames that appear in the records of the lost colony, including Dare, Cooper, and others. And some Lumbee individuals have physical features that suggest mixed European and Native American ancestry. In the 1880s, when the Lumbee were seeking recognition as a Native American tribe, they specifically claimed descent from the lost colonists, calling themselves the Croatoan Indians. While this claim was partly political, designed to distinguish them from African Americans in the highly segregated South, it was also based on genuine oral traditions and family histories. The Lumbee people's traditions about their origins are specific and detailed, describing how English colonists came to live among their ancestors, how they intermarried, and how their combined descendants eventually became the Lumbee people. Modern genetic studies have added another dimension to this theory. DNA analysis of Lumbee individuals has revealed European genetic markers that could be consistent with 17th century English ancestry. However, interpreting these results is complicated. European DNA in Native American populations could come from many sources. English, French, Spanish, and other European settlers and traders interacted with Native Americans throughout the colonial period. Determining whether specific European genetic lineages date back to the lost colony, as opposed to later contact, is extremely difficult. Nevertheless, the presence of European DNA in populations with oral traditions claiming lost colony descent is intriguing and consistent with the integration theory. Archaeological evidence also supports the possibility of integration. Excavations on Hatteras Island, the location of the historical Croatoan, have uncovered artifacts from the late 16th century that suggest contact between Native Americans and Europeans. These include European-made items like rings, a writing slate, and other objects that could have been traded to or brought by the lost colonists. A particularly significant find was a rapier guard, a piece of an English sword, discovered in a Native American context on Hatteras Island. This suggests that English people, or English goods, were present in Croatoan territory during the relevant time period. The integration theory also makes logical sense given the colonists' situation. By 1587 or shortly thereafter, They would have realized that John White had not returned as promised. They were running low on supplies. They were living on an island with limited farming potential. They were surrounded by some hostile Native American groups and were vulnerable to attack. Meanwhile, just 50 miles away lived the Croatoan people, who were friendly to the English and who had the local knowledge, food resources, and security that the colonists desperately needed. Moving to Croatoan Island to seek their protection and assistance would have been a rational survival strategy. Once among the Croatoan, the colonists might have faced a choice: maintain their separate identity and remain distinctly English, or integrate more fully into Croatoan society. Over time, based on patterns we see in other colonial contexts, integration would have become increasingly likely. Intermarriage would have been practical and perhaps necessary. English colonists and Croatoan people would have worked together, shared resources, and faced common challenges. Children born to mixed couples would have been raised in both cultures. As the original colonists aged and died, their descendants would have been increasingly integrated into Native American society, likely speaking both English and Algonquian languages, practicing both English and native customs, and identifying with both heritages. This scenario of gradual integration could help explain why no large group of recognizably English people was ever found. Based on what we know of colonial survival patterns and Native American integration practices, it's reasonable to suggest they did not remain a distinct English community waiting to be rescued. Instead, they may have become part of Native American society, their English identity diluted over generations, until it became just one thread in the complex fabric of indigenous culture. Their European genes, English surnames, and perhaps some cultural practices or technologies could have persisted, but their distinct identity as English colonists would have gradually faded away. The integration theory also helps explain why John White could not find them when he returned in 1590. If the colonists had recently relocated to Croatoan Island, they might not have been at the main village when White attempted to search for them. It's possible they were at fishing camps, hunting territories, or other seasonal locations that Native American communities regularly used. Or the storm that prevented White from completing his search might have come just as he was on the verge of finding them. The timing was tragically unlucky, though not impossible to imagine. However, the integration theory also faces significant challenges and unanswered questions. If the colonists did reach Croatoan Island and live among the Croatoan people, why did later English expeditions not find more concrete evidence of their presence? The Jamestown colonists, arriving just 17 years later, heard rumors of English people among the tribes, but never confirmed these reports or located any survivors. If a significant group of English people or their children were living with the Croatoan, surely someone would have encountered them and recorded the meeting. Additionally, the Lumbee connection, while intriguing, is not without problems. The Lumbee live far inland from Croatoan Island, and the route they would have had to take to get there would have passed through territories of other tribes. How and why the colonists or their descendants would have moved so far from the coast is unclear. The timeline is also questionable. By the time the Lumbee were clearly established as a distinct people in the 18th century, more than a century had passed since the lost colony. Could oral traditions and genetic markers really preserve the connection across such a long time span, or are other explanations more likely? The genetic evidence, while suggestive, is not conclusive. DNA studies can confirm that European ancestry exists in a population, but dating that ancestry precisely to the late 16th century is much more difficult. Later intermarriage with European settlers in the 17th and 18th centuries could just as easily explain the genetic findings. Without DNA from known lost colony descendants to compare against, it is difficult to make definitive claims. Despite these challenges, The integration and survival theory remains one of the most hopeful and compelling explanations for the lost colony's fate. It suggests that the colonists did not all die horrible deaths, but rather made smart decisions, forged successful alliances, and ultimately survived by adapting to their new world. It suggests that their descendants might still be among us, carrying the genetic and cultural legacy of those bold pioneers who vanished into history. For many people, this theory offers a kind of closure that other, darker theories cannot provide. Rather than a tragedy of death and destruction, it tells a story of survival, adaptation, and the blending of cultures. Whether that story is true, however, remains one of history's most persistent questions. Major theories: tragedy and death. While the integration theory offers a relatively hopeful explanation for the lost colony's fate, many other theories suggest darker outcomes. These tragedy theories propose that some or all of the colonists died within a short time of John White's departure, victims of violence, disease, starvation, or natural disaster. These theories paint a picture not of successful adaptation and survival, but of catastrophe and loss. Understanding these darker possibilities requires looking at the various threats the colonists faced and the historical evidence that might support these tragic scenarios. The Spanish attack theory suggests that Spanish forces discovered and destroyed the Roanoke colony. This theory has some historical plausibility. Spain claimed much of the southeastern coast of North America, and Spanish authorities viewed English colonization attempts as illegal invasions of Spanish territory. Spain had the military capability to launch expeditions against the colony. Spanish documents from the period show that Spanish officials were aware of English activities in Virginia and discussed plans to locate and eliminate English settlements. If Spanish forces had found Roanoke Island, they might well have killed or captured the colonists. However, this theory faces significant challenges. No Spanish records have been found that document an attack on or discovery of the Roanoke colony. Spanish administrators were meticulous record keepers, and an action as significant as destroying an English colony would certainly have been documented and reported to officials in Spain. The absence of such documentation is a strong argument against this theory. Additionally, if the Spanish had captured English colonists, they likely would have taken at least some of them prisoner to interrogate about English plans and activities. The complete disappearance of all colonists with no prisoners or survivors seems unlikely in a Spanish military action. The Powhatan massacre theory is perhaps more plausible. This theory suggests that the powerful Powhatan Confederacy, led by Chief Wahun Seneca, attacked and killed the colonists, possibly after they had relocated from Roanoke Island to the Chesapeake Bay area. As we discussed earlier, William Strachey, secretary of the Jamestown colony, recorded Native American accounts claiming that Powhatan had ordered the massacre of English people living near Chesapeake Bay shortly before the Jamestown colonists arrived. Strachey's accounts describe how Powhatan, fearing that these English settlers would ally with his enemies, sent warriors to destroy their settlements. The accounts speak of colonists killed while working in fields, of villages burned, of some survivors taken captive. If these accounts refer to the lost colonists, it would mean they survived for 20 years after White's departure, only to be killed in a preemptive strike by a powerful Native American leader. This theory has some supporting evidence. Archaeological surveys in the Chesapeake Bay region have identified possible sites of English presence from the late 16th century. The Chesapeake area was the original intended destination for the 1587 colony before Simon Fernandez forced them to stay at Roanoke. It is possible that the colonists eventually relocated there, either immediately after leaving Roanoke or gradually over several years. The Powhatan Confederacy was indeed powerful enough and willing to use violence against potential threats. The timing of the reported massacre, occurring around 1606 or 1607, suggests that Powhatan might have viewed any English presence as connected to the new Jamestown colony and decided to eliminate this potential threat. However, this theory also has problems. If the colonists had survived for 20 years and established settlements in the Chesapeake area, why was there no direct contact with English ships during that entire period? English vessels regularly sailed along the coast. Surely some contact would have occurred. Additionally, the Native American accounts recorded by Strachey are not entirely consistent, and some historians question whether they actually refer to the lost colonists or to other unknown groups of English people who might have been in the region. Without more concrete evidence, the Powhatan massacre theory remains speculative. Disease and starvation theories propose that the colonists simply died from illness or lack of food. This scenario requires no violence or dramatic events, just the grinding reality of survival in an unfamiliar environment without adequate supplies. The colonists arrived at Roanoke too late in the season to plant adequate crops. They were dependent on supplies from England that never arrived. They needed to maintain good trading relationships with Native Americans to obtain food, but those relationships were complicated by the violence of the previous Lane expedition. A combination of poor harvests, failed hunting and fishing efforts, disrupted trade, and the depletion of stored supplies could have led to slow starvation. Disease could have been equally devastating. The colonists would have been exposed to unfamiliar diseases from the indigenous population. They lacked the immunity that Native Americans had developed to local pathogens. Conversely, the colonists themselves could have brought European diseases that devastated both their own community and nearby Native American populations. Smallpox, measles, influenza, and other European diseases had catastrophic effects on Native American populations throughout the Americas. If the colonists inadvertently sparked an epidemic, it could have killed both English and native peoples, disrupting trade relationships and food supplies even further. A particularly intriguing piece of evidence supporting the drought and starvation theory comes from modern tree ring analysis. Scientists studying tree rings from bald cypress trees in the region have documented an extreme drought that lasted from 1587 to 1589, coinciding exactly with the period when the lost colonists were struggling to survive. This drought was the worst in the region in 800 years. It would have devastated crop yields, reduced populations of game animals, depleted fish populations in rivers and streams, and strained Native American food supplies. Both the English colonists and the native peoples they depended on for trade would have been under severe stress. In such conditions, survival would have been extremely difficult. The colonists might have slowly died from hunger and disease even if they had relocated to Croatoan Island. The drought would have affected the entire region, not just Roanoke Island. Natural disaster theories propose more sudden catastrophes. Hurricanes regularly strike the Outer Banks, and a powerful storm could have destroyed the colony. However, this theory does not explain why the buildings were still standing when White returned, or where the colonists' bodies would have gone. Other natural disasters seem even less likely. There is no evidence of earthquakes, volcanic activity, or other geological events that could have destroyed the colony. The various tragedy theories all share a common weakness. They struggle to explain the Croatoan carving and the orderly abandonment of the settlement. If the colonists were dying from disease and starvation, would they have had the organization and energy to carve a message, carefully pack up their belongings, and either relocate or arrange for the disposal of their dead? If they were attacked and killed, who carved the message? The evidence from the abandoned settlement suggests a planned departure rather than a sudden catastrophe. This does not rule out tragic endings, but it suggests that if disaster befell the colonists, it probably happened after they left Roanoke Island rather than on the island itself. It is also possible, and perhaps likely, that different colonists met different fates. Some might have died from disease or starvation during the first difficult years. Others might have been killed in conflicts with hostile Native American groups. Still others might have successfully integrated with the Croatoan or other tribes. A few might even have been captured by the Spanish or the Powhatan Confederacy. Rather than a single answer to what happened to the lost colony, there might be multiple answers, a complex story of survival and death, integration and isolation, hope and tragedy playing out over years or even decades. The tragedy theories remind us that colonization was an extraordinarily dangerous undertaking. Most early colonial attempts failed. People died from disease, starvation, violence, and exposure with depressing regularity. The lost colony's disappearance, while mysterious in its details, fits a broader pattern of colonial failure. What makes it unique is not that the colonists probably died, but that they disappeared so completely that we still debate their fate more than 4 centuries later. Archaeological investigations. Digging for truth. For centuries, the lost colony story was the province of historians working with written documents, oral traditions, and speculation. But in recent decades, archaeology has added new dimensions to our understanding of what might have happened to the colonists. Modern archaeological techniques, including ground-penetrating radar, careful excavation strategies, artifact analysis, and dating technologies, have allowed researchers to search for physical evidence of the colonists' presence and fate. While these investigations have not solved the mystery, they have uncovered tantalizing clues and opened new avenues of inquiry. Roanoke Island itself has been the subject of numerous archaeological investigations. The challenge is that the island has been continuously inhabited and developed over the centuries, with modern construction, roads, and landscaping potentially destroying or obscuring evidence from the 16th century. Additionally, coastal erosion has claimed parts of the island, and some areas that were dry land in 1587 are now underwater. Despite these challenges, archaeologists have identified locations that likely correspond to the 1587 settlement. In 1991, a team of archaeologists discovered what they believed to be the site of the main fort of the lost colony. The location contained artifacts from the late 16th century, including pottery fragments, nails, and other items consistent with English colonization. The fort site showed evidence of earthwork fortifications, matching descriptions from John White's account. While these findings do not tell us what happened to the colonists, they help confirm the historical record and provide a better understanding of where the colony was located and how it was organized. More recently, in 2012, researchers examining one of John White's maps discovered a hidden symbol beneath a patch that had been glued onto the map. Using X-ray technology, they revealed a small fort symbol marked at a location along the Albemarle Sound, about 50 miles inland from Roanoke Island. This discovery was exciting because it suggested that White, or the colonists, had identified a potential secondary site or relocation destination. This site, known as Site X, has since been investigated archaeologically. Excavations at Site X, located near Edenton, North Carolina, have revealed artifacts that could be connected to the lost colony. These include European objects dating to the late 16th century found in Native American contexts, suggesting contact between English people and indigenous populations in the area. Items include borderware pottery fragments of types known to have been brought by the colonists, a copper aglet or metal tip from an Elizabethan garment or bag, and other items that would have been used by English colonists. These finds suggest that some colonists might have relocated to this area, either temporarily or permanently, and interacted with local Native American communities. The interpretation of these artifacts remains debated. Skeptics point out that European trade goods could have reached inland Native American sites through trade networks without any colonists being present. The items could have been traded from Roanoke Island to inland tribes, or they could have come from other sources of European contact. However, the combination of John White's hidden map symbol and the archaeological evidence creates an intriguing possibility. Perhaps some colonists did relocate inland, establishing themselves at multiple sites as they sought better living conditions and friendly Native American allies. Hatteras Island, the location of historical Croatoan, has also been the subject of intensive archaeological investigation. Excavations there have revealed numerous European artifacts from the late 16th century in Native American contexts. These include rings, a broken rapier, gun flints, pieces of European pottery, and copper items. One particularly significant find was a signet ring with a design that might be connected to one of the lost colony families. These artifacts strongly suggest that English people or English goods were present on Hatteras Island during the relevant time period, supporting the theory that at least some colonists relocated to Croatoan, as the carved message indicated. The Croatoan Archaeological Project, led by archaeologists from the University of Bristol and other institutions, has been systematically excavating sites on Hatteras Island for years. Their findings paint a picture of extensive contact between Native Americans and Europeans in the late 16th century. The European artifacts are not just trade goods, but personal items and pieces of military equipment that suggest English people were actually living at the site. The archaeological team has been careful not to make definitive claims, but their findings are consistent with lost colonists having relocated to and integrated with these Croatoan people. One of the most controversial pieces of potential evidence for the lost colony is the so-called Dare Stones. In 1937, a stone was found in North Carolina that bore an inscription purporting to be from Eleanor Dare, John White's daughter and the mother of Virginia Dare. The inscription, carved into a flat stone, described the fate of the colonists, claiming that most had died from disease and starvation, that Eleanor's husband and daughter were among the dead, and that only 7 colonists still survived as of 1591. The stone was written in Elizabethan English with numerous spelling errors and abbreviations. The Dare stone caused a sensation when it was discovered. If genuine, it would be direct testimony from one of the lost colonists about what happened to them. However, the stone's authenticity was immediately questioned. Over the following years, dozens more stones appeared, each supposedly continuing Eleanor Dare's story. These additional stones stretched credibility and displayed increasingly obvious signs of fraud. Most scholars concluded that all the Dare stones, including the first one, were hoaxes created by someone with knowledge of the lost colony story, but also some significant historical errors and anachronisms. In recent years, some researchers have revisited the question of the first Dare stone's authenticity, suggesting that while the subsequent stones were clearly fraudulent, the original might still be genuine. They point to certain elements of the inscription that match Elizabethan writing conventions and to the stone's petrography being consistent with the region where it was found. However, most historians and archaeologists remain skeptical. The unusual circumstances of the stone's discovery, the timing coinciding with the 350th anniversary of Virginia Dare's birth, and the cascade of obvious fakes that followed, all suggest caution. Unless additional evidence emerges, the Dare stones remain at best highly questionable and at worst definite hoaxes. Scientific dating techniques have also been applied to the lost colony question. Tree ring analysis, as mentioned earlier, confirmed an extreme drought during the colonists' first years. This provides environmental context that helps explain the challenges they faced. Radiocarbon dating of artifacts has helped confirm that certain European items found in archaeological contexts do indeed date to the late 16th century. DNA analysis, while not yet definitive, continues to be applied to populations with claimed lost colony connections. One of the limitations of archaeological investigation is that it tends to find evidence of presence rather than evidence of absence. Archaeologists can demonstrate that English people or goods were at a particular location, but it is much harder to prove that people were not at a location or that they all died. The negative evidence, the absence of bodies or clear evidence of catastrophe, is harder to interpret. Does the absence of evidence mean the colonists survived and relocated, or does it simply mean we have not found the evidence yet? Despite these limitations, archaeology has substantially enriched our understanding of the lost colony. We now know that the colonists' planned destinations included both Croatoan Island and possibly inland sites like Site X. We know that European goods and possibly people were present in multiple locations around coastal North Carolina in the late 16th century. We know that the colonists faced environmental challenges, including a devastating drought. And we know that the relationship between English colonists and Native Americans involved extensive trade, interaction, and possibly integration. Each new archaeological discovery adds another piece to the puzzle, even if the complete picture remains frustratingly out of focus. Modern technology continues to offer new possibilities for investigation. Remote sensing, ground-penetrating radar, LiDAR mapping, and other non-invasive techniques allow archaeologists to survey large areas and identify promising sites for excavation. Improved DNA analysis techniques might eventually allow more definitive conclusions about genetic connections between modern populations and the lost colonists. Digital humanities approaches, including computer modeling and big data analysis of historical documents, might reveal connections and patterns that previous researchers missed. The investigation of the lost colony is far from over. Each generation of researchers brings new tools, new perspectives, and new discoveries to this centuries-old mystery. Cultural impact and legacy. The lost colony of Roanoke has captured the American imagination in a way that few other historical mysteries have achieved. For more than 4 centuries, the story has been retold, reimagined, and reinvented in countless ways. It has inspired novels, plays, films, television shows, academic studies, amateur investigations, and endless speculation. The mystery has become part of American cultural DNA, a story that speaks to something fundamental about the American experience and identity. Understanding the cultural impact of the lost colony helps us understand not just what happened to those vanished colonists, but what they have come to mean to us. The appeal of the lost colony story operates on multiple levels. At its most basic, it is a compelling mystery with all the elements of a great puzzle: a clear beginning, a dramatic disappearance, a cryptic clue, and no definitive solution. Humans are naturally drawn to puzzles and mysteries. We want to solve them, to uncover the truth, to bring order to chaos. The lost colony offers a historical puzzle that seems like it should be solvable. The colonists existed. They went somewhere or something happened to them. There should be an answer. The fact that we have not found that answer after 400 years of looking only makes the mystery more compelling. On a deeper level, the lost colony represents the beginning of the American story. It predates Jamestown, Plymouth Rock, and all the other famous landmarks of American colonization. It represents the first English attempt to establish a lasting presence in what would become the United States. The colonists were pioneers who risked everything to come to an unknown land. In American cultural mythology, pioneers and risk-takers hold a special place. The lost colonists embody these values, making them cultural ancestors to all Americans who trace their identity to European colonization and settlement. The story also touches on themes of loss, abandonment, and isolation that resonate with many people. John White's anguish at being unable to return to his family, the colonists' gradual realization that help might not be coming, the fear and uncertainty they must have felt, these are universal human experiences. The Lost Colony reminds us that early colonization was a traumatic experience filled with suffering, loss, and tragedy. It counters triumphalist narratives of European expansion with a story of failure and disappearance. In this sense, it humanizes history, reminding us that behind the dates and events were real people with hopes, fears, and ultimately unknowable fates. The mystery has inspired an enormous body of creative work. Novels have reimagined the colonists' fate in countless ways. Some portray survival and integration with Native Americans. Others depict tragic endings. Some add supernatural or science fiction elements, suggesting time travel, aliens, or paranormal forces. The flexibility of the mystery, the absence of a definitive answer, allows writers to explore their own interpretations while staying true to the historical framework. The emotional core of the story, the disappearance of families, including the first English child born in America, provides rich material for dramatic storytelling. Paul Green's historical drama, The Lost Colony, first performed in 1937, has become an institution unto itself. This outdoor drama, performed annually at the Waterside Theater on Roanoke Island, has been entertaining audiences for more than 80 years. It tells a dramatized version of the colony's story, from the first arrival through the mysterious disappearance. The production has become a significant tourist attraction, drawing visitors to Roanoke Island and the Outer Banks specifically to experience this piece of living history. The pageant has helped keep the Lost Colony story in public consciousness and has introduced countless people to the mystery. The Lost Colony has also become significant for North Carolina's tourism industry and regional identity. Roanoke Island, Manteo, Hatteras Island, and other locations associated with the mystery attract history enthusiasts, mystery buffs, and tourists interested in early American history. The Fort Raleigh National Historic Site preserves and interprets the location of the colony. Museums, interpretive centers, and historical markers throughout the region tell the story. The Lost Colony has become part of the area's brand, a unique historical asset that distinguishes the region and draws visitors who might otherwise simply pass through on their way to beach vacations. In academic circles, the Lost Colony has generated substantial scholarly work. Historians, archaeologists, anthropologists, and other researchers have produced books, articles, and dissertations exploring every aspect of the colony and its disappearance. The mystery has provided opportunities for interdisciplinary work, bringing together specialists in colonial history, Native American studies, archaeology, environmental history, and other fields. Academic conferences have been devoted to the topic. University research teams continue to investigate archaeological sites. The Lost Colony serves as a case study for understanding early colonization, European Native American contact, and the challenges of historical interpretation when evidence is limited. The story has also become intertwined with debates about historical memory, cultural identity, and the ethics of colonization. Modern retellings increasingly emphasize Native American perspectives and experiences. There is growing recognition that the mystery of the Lost Colony might not be such a mystery from the indigenous perspective, that Native Americans probably knew exactly what happened to the colonists, but their knowledge was not recorded or valued by European chroniclers. This shift in perspective reflects broader changes in how we understand colonial history, moving away from Eurocentric narratives toward more inclusive and nuanced accounts that recognize indigenous peoples as historical actors rather than background scenery. For the Lumbee people of North Carolina, the Lost Colony is not just a historical curiosity, but part of their own origin story and identity. The Lumbee's claims of descent from the colonists, whether ultimately proven or not, represent an attempt to assert a particular kind of identity in the complex racial and cultural landscape of the American South. The lost colony connection has been used to distinguish the Lumbee from other groups, to claim a unique heritage, and to resist simple categorizations. Whether or not genetic testing ever definitively proves a connection to the lost colonists, the story has become part of Lumbee cultural identity in ways that have real meaning and significance for the community. The endurance of the lost colony mystery speaks to something fundamental about how humans relate to the past. We want to believe that historical mysteries can be solved, that enough research and investigation will eventually reveal the truth. The lost colony offers hope that if we just look in the right place, use the right technology, or ask the right questions, we will finally know what happened. At the same time, there is something almost comforting about an unsolved mystery. It leaves room for imagination, for multiple interpretations, for ongoing discovery. A mystery that is completely solved loses some of its power. The lost colony's continued mysteriousness keeps it alive in our cultural consciousness in a way that a fully explained historical event might not. The story also reminds us of the limits of historical knowledge. We tend to think of history as a collection of facts and dates, events that are known and recorded. The lost colony challenges this assumption. Here is an event that definitely happened, involving more than 100 people, that took place only 400 years ago in a region that has been continuously inhabited since, and we still do not know for certain what happened. This should humble us about our ability to know the past with complete certainty. It reminds us that history is always an interpretation, always incomplete, always subject to revision as new evidence emerges or new perspectives are applied. In the end, the lost colony has become more than a historical mystery. It is a cultural touchstone, a story that connects us to the earliest days of European colonization in North America, while also raising questions about cultural contact, survival, adaptation, and the very nature of historical knowledge. Whether the mystery is ever definitively solved or remains forever open to interpretation, the story of those vanished colonists will continue to fascinate, to inspire, and to remind us of the courage, tragedy, and enduring mystery of the human experience. Conclusion: the mystery endures. As we reach the end of our journey through the story of the lost colony of Roanoke, we find ourselves in a familiar position, faced with tantalizing clues, compelling theories, and frustratingly incomplete answers. After more than 4 centuries of investigation, speculation, and debate, we still cannot say with absolute certainty what happened to John White's colonists after they carved that single word into a wooden post. Yet perhaps that uncertainty, that enduring mystery, is precisely what makes the lost colony story so powerful and so persistent in our cultural imagination. What do we know for certain? We know that 117 colonists arrived on Roanoke Island in July of 1587. We know they included men, women, and children, among them Eleanor Dare and her newborn daughter, Virginia. We know their governor, John White, departed for England in late August to organize a supply mission. We know that White was unable to return for 3 years due to war with Spain and various other obstacles. We know that when he finally reached Roanoke Island in August of 1590, he found the settlement abandoned, the buildings still standing, but the people gone. We know that someone carved the word Croatoan into a post, following the agreed-upon protocol for indicating their destination. And we know that no definitive trace of the colonists was ever found, despite searches, investigations, and speculation that continue to this day. Beyond these basic facts, we enter the realm of theory and interpretation. The evidence we have examined points in multiple directions. The Croatoan carving and the absence of a distress signal suggest a planned relocation, most likely to Croatoan Island, where Manteo's people could provide assistance. Archaeological evidence from Hatteras Island supports the possibility that English people or goods were present there in the late 16th century. The oral traditions of the Lumbee people and genetic evidence suggest that some colonists may have survived, integrated with Native American populations, and left descendants who live on today. These pieces of evidence paint a picture of survival and adaptation. But other evidence points to darker possibilities. The extreme drought documented by tree ring analysis would have made survival difficult anywhere in the region. William Strachey's accounts of English people killed by Powhatan's forces suggest that at least some colonists may have met violent ends. The complete silence from the colonists after 1587, with no letters, no messages, no confirmed sightings, suggests that something prevented them from maintaining contact with England. The failure of multiple expeditions to locate survivors or find definitive evidence of their fate suggests that whatever happened was complete and final, leaving little trace behind. The most likely scenario, and the one that many researchers now favor, combines elements of multiple theories. The colonists probably did relocate from Roanoke Island, possibly to multiple locations, including Croatoan Island and inland sites. Some probably died during the early years from disease, starvation, or violence. Others probably survived by integrating with Native American communities, particularly the Croatoan. Over time, these survivors would have intermarried with indigenous peoples, their English identity gradually fading as they or their children became part of Native American society. Some groups of colonists or their descendants might have been killed in later conflicts, possibly by Powhatan's forces, as Strachey's accounts suggest. The result would be a dispersed population of survivors and descendants, no longer recognizably English, scattered across the region and ultimately absorbed into the indigenous population. This scenario explains many of the puzzling aspects of the mystery. It accounts for the Croatoan carving and the orderly abandonment of Roanoke Island. It explains why no large group of English people was ever found, despite multiple searches. It is consistent with reports of Europeans living among native tribes and with the Lumbee traditions of lost colony ancestry. It acknowledges the reality of colonial mortality while also allowing for survival and adaptation. And it recognizes that the colonists' fate was probably not a single event, but a series of events unfolding over years or decades, affecting different groups of colonists in different ways. Yet even this relatively comprehensive scenario leaves questions unanswered. If some colonists survived and had children with Native Americans, why did none of these children or their descendants ever seek to contact English ships or settlements? Why was there no attempt to reclaim an English identity, or to inform later English colonists of their existence? Did they not know how to make contact? Did they choose not to? Or had their English identity become so attenuated that they no longer thought of themselves as English at all? These questions may never have satisfactory answers. The human element of the lost colony story deserves our final consideration. Behind the historical mystery were real people facing unimaginable challenges. Imagine being a colonist on Roanoke Island in 1588 or 1589. John White has not returned. Your supplies are running low. Winter is coming. You are surrounded by an unfamiliar wilderness and peoples whose languages and customs you barely understand. You have left behind everything you knew in England, and now you must confront the possibility that you are truly on your own, that help may never come, that you must make a new life in this strange land, or die trying. The courage, fear, desperation, and determination those colonists must have felt are almost impossible to comprehend from our comfortable modern perspective. For John White, the tragedy was different but equally profound. He spent the rest of his life knowing that he had failed to return to his family as promised. Whether they died cursing his absence or survived to build new lives without him, he would never know. His daughter Eleanor would have been in her 30s when he last tried to find her. His granddaughter Virginia would have been 3 years old. What became of them? Did they survive childhood? Did they remember him? Did they forgive him for his absence? These questions must have haunted White until his death. In his final writings about the colony, we can hear his anguish, his guilt, and his desperate hope that somehow, somewhere, they had survived. The Lost Colony also reminds us of the broader context of colonization and its impact on indigenous peoples. While we focus on the mystery of the English colonists' disappearance, we should not forget that their arrival and the subsequent waves of colonization they represented would have catastrophic consequences for Native American populations. Disease, warfare, displacement, and cultural destruction would follow European colonization throughout the Americas. The Croatoan, Secotan, and other tribes of coastal North Carolina would see their worlds utterly transformed over the following centuries. Their perspective on the lost colony, had it been recorded and preserved, might offer insights that English sources could never provide. As we conclude this exploration of America's oldest unsolved mystery, we are left with a story that refuses neat resolution, but offers something perhaps more valuable. A window into the complexity of history, the courage of pioneers, and the enduring power of mystery. The Lost Colony challenges us to think deeply about how we know what we know about the past, about the limits of evidence and interpretation, and about the ways that historical mysteries become cultural narratives that shape our understanding of ourselves and our origins. New evidence will continue to emerge. Archaeologists will continue to excavate sites. DNA studies will become more sophisticated. Historical documents may yet be discovered in archives. Each new finding has the potential to shift our understanding of what happened to those vanished colonists. Perhaps one day we will know their fate with certainty. Perhaps the mystery will be solved, the Croatoan carving finally interpreted beyond doubt. Or perhaps the lost colony will remain forever lost, its story complete in its incompleteness, a reminder that some questions may never be answered, no matter how desperately we seek closure. Whatever the ultimate truth, the story of the Roanoke colony matters. It matters as history, as the record of the first English attempt to settle permanently in North America. It matters as cultural narrative, as a story that has shaped American identity and imagination for centuries. It matters as human drama, as a reminder of the real people who risked everything for the promise of a new life in a new world. And it matters as mystery, as an enduring puzzle that challenges each generation to bring new perspectives and new techniques to the search for truth. So we leave you here, at the end of our exploration, but not at the end of the story. The lost colony of Roanoke remains out there somewhere, in the soil of North Carolina, in the DNA of descendant populations, in the oral traditions of the Lumbee people, in archaeological sites yet to be fully excavated, and in the imaginations of everyone who has ever wondered what happened to those 117 colonists who vanished without a trace. Their story is unfinished because the mystery endures. And perhaps that is exactly as it should be. Some mysteries, like some aspects of the human experience, resist complete explanation. The lost colony of Roanoke stands as a testament to courage, tragedy, adaptation, and the enduring power of the unknown. If you enjoyed this journey into one of history's greatest mysteries, please consider subscribing to our channel. We explore unsolved mysteries, forgotten histories, and the strange corners of the human experience, all designed to accompany you through the quiet hours of the night. Share this video with anyone who loves historical mysteries, and let us know in the comments which theory you find most compelling. Did the colonists survive by integrating with Native Americans? Did they perish from drought and disease? Did something else entirely happen? The mystery is yours to ponder as you drift off to sleep, dreaming perhaps of a small island off the Carolina coast, of a carved word that echoes through the centuries, and of the people who vanished into history but never quite disappeared from our imaginations. Sleep well, and remember, some of the best stories are the ones that never truly end.